It's chapter 7, photosynthesis. Okay, so at a very basic minimum, you have to know what goes into photosynthesis, what comes out of photosynthesis, and why. Okay, what goes into photosynthesis? Well, first, water goes into photosynthesis. This is going to be a source of electrons and protons for the process. Carbon dioxide goes into photosynthesis. We're going to use the carbon and oxygen to build up glucose. Also goes into this light energy, the sun. What comes out? Oxygen. Why oxygen? Because going back to the water on the far left, as we remove the protons and electrons, the H's and the E's, we're left with oxygen as a byproduct. Also what comes out is glucose. So we see carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Where did the carbon and oxygen come from? They came from carbon dioxide. That's why you put carbon dioxide into this process. The hydrogens there, where do those come from? Ultimately, from water. Okay, so we talked about the properties of light, and that visible light is a very narrow part of electromagnetic radiation. You should know what a wavelength is, the distance between two successive points. Here's the important point for biology is pigments. Pigments are going to absorb light at a specific wavelength. Okay, so going back to this image right here, okay, we see that visible light, right, has several different wavelengths correlated to color of light. Okay, so for example, the ultraviolet light is a shorter wavelength, 400 nanometers. Red is a longer wavelength of light, 700 nanometers. But the point is that pigments are going to absorb a range of light and a range of wavelengths. Now, plants have multiple pigments in them. Chlorophyll, I'm sure you've heard of that. Beta-carotene is another one. But a plant is going to have multiple pigments in the leaves in order to absorb light energy of varying wavelengths. Now we're going to look at photosystem 1 and photosystem 2 with chlorophyll, but be aware that there are other pigments in a plant. And the pigments are going to absorb the energy of light, and they're going to excite electrons, and this will drive the formation of ATP and NADPH. And we'll get to that in a few minutes, but that's the point. We're taking the energy of sunlight and converting that to ATP and NADPH. Later on, this is going to be converted to glucose. But what absorbs the light energy, what does this, are the pigments. So ultimately, pigments are going to superexcite, and they're going to push electrons to a higher energy level. And that's all that's happening. That photons of light come in, those photons energize electrons, and the movement of those electrons ultimately leads to the production of ATP. Color, I'm sure you've probably heard this before, but whatever something color is actually the light that is being reflected off of it. Okay, so if something is green, what does that tell you? That tells you that other wavelengths of light are being absorbed, and what the color you see is actually what? What's being reflected. Now, let's go on to photosynthesis. So who does photosynthesis? Well, who does photosynthesis are photoautotrophs. Phototrophs are ones that use light energy as a source of energy, and autotrophs are going to use carbon dioxide from the atmosphere as a source of carbon. So who does photosynthesis and where? Well, obviously plants are going to do photosynthesis. Some bacteria will do photosynthesis, and some single-celled eukaryotic organisms. You may have seen the protist in lab, the Euglena in lab. those are single-celled eukaryotic organisms. Now, coming back to this idea of plants, not all plant cells will do photosynthesis. Okay, the leaves, right? You see leaves, they're green. Yes, photosynthesis happens in plant leaves. But, you know, there's a lot of cells in a plant that do not have direct exposure to the sun. For example, cells in the root system. Are they doing photosynthesis? And the answer to that is no, they are not. So what happens is the parts of the plant that can do photosynthesis will send the products of photosynthesis, glucose, carbohydrates, to cells that cannot do photosynthesis. Now, because of photosynthesis, what happened was our Earth changed dramatically. Because what does photosynthesis do? One, it releases oxygen, and two, it removes or fixes carbon dioxide. And these two processes cause a tremendous change in our atmosphere. First, it caused an evolutionary selective pressure. Okay, oxygen was hazardous for a lot of life. So either life adapted or it went away. Or it went to areas where there was no oxygen present. We even see those organisms, in particular bacteria, today. We call them anaerobes. Well, if you did stick around and were able to survive on oxygen, you needed to develop a pathway that used that oxygen very efficiently. So what we saw was that because of oxygen, metabolic pathways developed that used oxygen, we call that a terminal electron acceptor, and produced large amounts of ATP as a result. That's called aerobic respiration, and that's what we do. Also, that we saw the formation of an ozone layer. This ozone layer protected this Earth from ultraviolet radiation. And radiation can cause mutations in DNA, and this helped to protect, DNA in early life forms because it no longer was exposed to mass amounts of ultraviolet radiation. The carbon cycle is the cycling of carbon between producers and consumers. Producers, those are the plants. They are going to take in carbon dioxide and make carbon-containing compounds, such as glucose. Consumers, such as us, humans, we're going to take that glucose and other carbon-containing compounds, and we're going to what? We're going to do reactions to it and ultimately release carbon dioxide. Okay? What takes that carbon dioxide back in? The plants. And there's this cyclic action going on where the plants release carbon-containing compounds. We take those carbon-containing compounds, such as glucose, and we release CO2. The plants absorb that CO2. And there's a cyclic nature to the process. Okay, so photosynthesis. Again, this is photosynthesis. What goes into it? What comes out of it? What goes in is sunlight energy, carbon dioxide, and water. What comes out is carbohydrates and oxygen. And photosynthesis is just the conversion and the capture of light energy by pigments and converting that light energy into the potential energy of the chemical bond. So in this diagram, the light energy above the leaf, that energy goes into photosynthesis, and we convert that energy. We do an energy conversion to glucose. And glucose will also be a carrier of energy, but a different form of energy. Here, the energy is chemical potential energy. So where do we do photosynthesis? We do photosynthesis in the chloroplast. Okay, so you know what a chloroplast is. Stroma, thacloid membrane. Okay, now thacloid membrane, really important here. This is where the light reaction happens in photosynthesis. Okay, now I'm just going to scan forward here really fast and show you a diagram of the thacloid membrane. Okay, The image on the bottom is the thylakoid membrane. Okay, that is where the light-dependent reaction of photosynthesis happens. Another picture of the thylakoid membrane. This is where the light-dependent reaction of photosynthesis happens. Okay, so we're going to talk about this for a few minutes, but understand what we're talking about happens in the thylakoid membrane. Okay? Another thing is photosystems. Be aware that the first photosystem is photosystem 2, the second photosystem is photosystem 1. Okay? These are containing pigments that will absorb light energy. Now there's multiple pigments, multiple antenna, if you will, inside each photosystem, but they direct all of their energy to just a few of the pigment centers. Okay, if you see on the image on the right, we have several green spheres, and then kind of in the center you see a green sphere that says P680, that's photosystem 1. What that's trying to show you is multiple pigments are absorbing light energy, but it's all directing it to one specific point, kind of like an antenna. Okay. Photosystems are groups of molecules where there are pigments that will absorb light energy and then raise that light energy using electrons to a higher state. And we'll talk about those in the next few slides. Very important point here is there's two separate reactions to photosynthesis. You have to know this. There's light-dependent reactions and light-independent reactions. Light-dependent reactions require light. You might have heard of these as the light reaction and the dark reaction in high school. Same idea, just kind of a different name for them now. Light-dependent reactions require light. They come first. Light-independent reactions use the products of the light-dependent reactions and come second. So light energy enters into light-dependent reactions. This is where oxygen is made, and also releases ATP and NADPH. The products of the light-dependent reaction, ATP, NADPH, will go to the light-independent reaction, and in concert with carbon dioxide, will form glucose/carbohydrates. Okay, so this is a very important slide. You should know what reactions, the two reactions, the light-dependent and independent, and we're going to talk about these in detail, but just be aware of what they are, what goes into them, what comes out. So let me just review one more time. Light-dependent reactions, what goes into it? 1, light energy. 2, water. What comes out of light-dependent reactions? 1, oxygen, because we have removed the protons and the electrons from the water that went in. ATP comes out. NADPH comes out. That's a hydrogen carrier. Next step, light-independent reactions, also called the dark reaction. What goes into this? ATP and NADPH. Those are energy and proton carriers. Carbon dioxide goes into this in the light-independent reaction. Okay, the carbon dioxide will provide the carbon source and the oxygen source for glucose. To combine all those, the hydrogens here will come from NADPH for glucose, and the energy to put it all together comes from ATP. Okay. So you should know these two reactions. So now we're going to talk about light-dependent reactions. So this is just the first part of the last one we talked about. This is just the light-dependent reaction. What starts light-dependent reaction? Okay, look to the far left. What happens? We see a water, an H2O, right? And we see electrons coming off that water. And as electrons and hydrogen protons, the H pluses, come off that water, what happens is what? Those electrons go to the photosystem. Okay, because we're going to boost electrons in charge. We're going to boost their energy up. But here's the thing, we need a source of electrons to do this. Because once it leaves that photosystem, it's going to go away from the photosystem. Okay, so let me actually go to this picture right here. Do you see this at the bottom? We have photosystem 2, so there's 3 images here. Look at the image on the bottom. It says light-dependent reaction of photosynthesis. Light energy comes in on the left. On the image on the bottom, we have photosystem 2. You see the yellow spheres? Those are electrons. When those electrons are boosted in energy in the photosystem 2, okay, they're going to move away from photosystem 2. Because they move away, we need a source of electrons to replenish them. And that's where water comes in. Because water is going to be a source of electrons for this process. But when we start taking things off of water, protons or H+, and electrons, we are changing the nature of water, okay, to another molecule. We're changing it from water, H2O, to O2, oxygen. Okay. So that's the first part, right? Photosystem 2 is taking water, ripping electrons off, and then oxygens. Those electrons go to the first photosystem called photosystem 2. Be aware, you have photosystem 2 and photosystem 1. Okay, they go in reverse number. Light will come into photosystem 2 and boost those electrons to a higher energy state. They're making them vibrate, shake just with energy, and that's going to hold on to energy. Those electrons will then move away from photosystem 2 to separate proteins called cytochromes, and as they do that, that's going to make ATP. Those electrons, as they hop down, what happens is, as those electrons move, they are lowering in energy because there's a transfer of energy from the electrons to the production of ATP. So that's why in this image, you see what? In the middle of it, we have primary acceptor and a series of arrows pointing down. That downward slope is indicating that the energy of the electrons as it moves through the electron transport chain is lowering. Where does that energy go? To the production of ATP. That's where it's going. So the electrons then make it to the next photosystem, which is photosystem 1. This uses light, a little bit different of a wavelength of light. This energizes the electrons to a higher state, and the same thing happens. It goes through an electron transport chain, in which case NADPH is made. Okay. End result. What's the end result here? What are we using? What are we making? We are using water, source of electrons and protons. We are using light. We are making ATP and NADPH. Okay, that's the point. This is the photosystem and the thalloid membrane, and it shows more of a location instead of an energy diagram. Before we're looking more of an energy, now we're looking at location. Water comes in, I'm going to go from left to right. To the left, HOH, that's water. We pull off electrons in the H pluses, leaving oxygen. That's why that arrow with the O is coming out. We take those electrons and go to photosystem 1. Light energy super excites those electrons, boosts their energy level. Because it boosts their energy level, then it goes through the electron transport chain, and that will make ATP through the movement of hydrogen protons. Okay. Electrons go to the next photosystem. That's somewhat in the middle. See photosystem 1? Light energy comes in of a particular wavelength. Boost those electrons to a higher energy state. Again, we lower those electrons from their energy state and we produce NADPH. End story here is what? What goes in? Water. What goes in? Light energy. What comes out? ATP. What comes out? NADPH. Where does the ATP, NADPH go? That goes to the next reaction, which is the light-independent reaction. So again, what comes out? ATP and NADPH goes to the Calvin cycle, or the light-independent reaction. What went in? Also, what comes out is oxygen. Okay, what went in was what? Water and light energy. Okay, so that covers the light-dependent reaction. Now we're going to talk about the light-independent reaction. Light-independent reaction, and here this is a good diagram of what comes in and what comes out. The light-dependent reaction we just talked about took in water, took in sunlight, released oxygen and NADPH and ATP. That oxygen is released, we take in that oxygen, okay? But what happens to that NADPH and ATP? Those are, well, the ATP here is a short-term energy carrier, okay? And the cell has to make a long-term energy carrier because the plant has many cells that cannot do photosynthesis. So they've got to transport a form of energy to cells in the roots and cells that cannot do photosynthesis. So the plant is going to take that short-term energy, that ATP, and convert it to a long-term energy form, carbohydrates. And that's the focus of the next cycle, the light-independent reaction. Okay. This is the Calvin cycle. No, you do not need to know this for the test, but understand what's going into this cycle. What's going into it? 1, ATP and NADPH. Do you see the red boxes? That's ATP energy. Okay, so we're putting energy into this. What else is entering into this? And by the way, where did that ATP come from? That came from the last set of reactions. We're putting NADPH into this. That will be a hydrogen carrier. Again, what do we see? We see that that came from the last reaction. And finally, we're at the very top. Carbon dioxide is entering into this also. That's the source of carbon that will make carbohydrates. Okay, so what are we doing? We're doing this transfer of energy from a few $20 bills, which is the ATP, into one $1,000 bill, which is the carbohydrate coming out at the very bottom. Okay? Because, why does a plant do this? Because it needs a source of energy that it can transport very easily from the leaf to the bottom of the plant. ATP is not that energy molecule. It's short term, it's like a $20 bill. The plant is making a $1,000 bill from many $20 bills. And that's what this cycle is all about. Okay? It's taking carbon dioxide, ATP, short-term energy carrier, NADPH, combining them all together, mashing them together to make glucose. Because of that glucose, that's the $1,000 bill. It can take that glucose and it can take it to different cells in the plant that cannot do photosynthesis. And that's the point. Okay. Now, I won't go through all these. We covered these slightly in class about the different cycles of the Calvin cycle. A good summary. Okay, what goes into this? What comes out? What goes in is that short-term energy carrier, ATP. What comes out? Glucose. Okay, a long-term energy carrier. What else went into this? What else went into this? Carbon dioxide. Why did CO2 go in? Because it's going to be the building block, primarily, for what comes out? Glucose. Okay, we're going to combine that CO2 and the hydrogens from NADPH, and we're going to make a hydrocarbon. You know this is glucose primarily. Other things can come from it, but right now, let's just say mostly glucose. We also talked about the CAM and C4 pathway. I won't add any more than is right here, but we also discussed this briefly in class. And that wraps up photosynthesis. But I just want to reiterate what goes into photosynthesis and what comes out. This is the key point. This is the point that we need to see with this. So I just want to make sure we see what goes in and what comes out. Okay, good picture here. What goes in? Well, first of all, one, where does this happen? Happens in the chloroplast. Two, what are the two steps of photosynthesis? They are the light-dependent reaction on the left, the light-independent reaction on the right. What goes into photosynthesis? Sunlight, source of energy. Water, source of electrons and protons. What comes out of the light-dependent reaction? Oxygen, because we ripped off the electrons and protons. The only thing left is the O2. What also comes out of the light-dependent reaction? Top arrow, NADPH and ATP, carriers of protons and energy. Where did the ATP get its energy from? Sunlight. Where did the NADPH get its hydrogen? From the water. We take the NADPH and ATP, again, energy carrier, we take that to the light-independent reaction, the Calvin cycle, primarily. What goes into the Calvin cycle? CO2, carbon dioxide. This is why plants breathe in CO2. They take it in. They're going to combine that with the energy in ATP and the hydrogens in NADPH to make carbohydrates, glucose primarily. Okay. What's the point of this? The light-dependent reaction is taking light energy and making $20 bills. One think of it that way. But those $20 bills cannot be transported throughout the whole plant, the whole tree, very easily. We need an easy-to-move source, and that's glucose. Has many different functions. The plant can actually build cell walls from glucose and do other things with glucose. So, you know, ATP is nice, but we need a form that we can take from the leaves and take all the way to the roots. And ATP is not that energy carrier. We then, to make that energy carrier we need, that $1,000 bill, if you will, we take an NADPH, an ATP, and combine it with CO2 and the light-independent reaction, and we make glucose. And that is our $1,000 bill. We can take that and go to the roots, and the roots can then rip that glucose apart into energy, which is the topic of the next chapter. Okay, that's the point. Know what goes in and where. What comes out. That's the point.